No, but thank you very much for sticking with us for another Garrett seminar. And just a very quick recap of our journey so far on rethinking past globalization with bracket S. Last week, we had a very, very strong start to the Easter term series by our very own Martin Jones, who talked about the varying mechanisms and paces that were at work in crop distribution across Eurasia. Whether you like the rice sticky or not, seems to be a very regional or even a cultural preference. But not only that, you also bring a very, very important point. You reminded us that the role of non-elite and small-scale society in the process, which seems to affect Schurat's focus on local agency in crop migration. But Sue Schurat, if you remember, like last term, seems to have told very, very different stories about past globalization, in which she emphasized the role played by elites in the exchange of raw materials, goods, as well as setting the fashion in prehistoric Mediterranean. An argument not too dissimilar to the message that Justin Jennings, the very first speaker of the series, tried to convey when he talked about expansion of warrior states in the Andes. But of course, this debate about the dynamics and balance between state and people, center and periphery is nothing new, as it was also a very cool debate in the world system theory, something we learned a lot from Barry Gill's talk. And as you may have realized by now, and probably not surprised, a lot of our speakers and probably all of us here have our own ideas and our own definitions about globalization, whether we like it or not, whether we should be using it or not. I'm not giving you Chris. And this is actually the purpose of this series. And adding to the mix is our speaker today, Dr. Izabela Romanowska. Today's lecture is indeed a very, very special one because we're crossing over with CDEL, the Computational and Digital Archaeology Research Group here. And Isa is a complexity scientist working on the interface between social science and computer science. And she began her career as a prehistoric archaeologist before transitioning to computer-based research. In her research, she employs agent-based modeling, simulation techniques to investigate long-term, large-scale dynamics of past human groups, such as mobility in prehistoric cities, the first out-of-Africa human dispersal, or large-scale economic interactions across Roman Mediterranean, as well as the case studies of social interactions in modern contexts, for example, real-time pedestrian flows in modern spots. FC Barcelona. So, road great to all of you, Isa, and her talk, Great Grains and Grievances.
All right, thank you so much for this kind introduction. I'm extremely sorry I have missed the previous talks. They sound absolutely thrilling. And I hope that what I'm going to be talking about will kind of continue the journey of the previous people that spoke. But in this case, we're going to be talking about a city, and a very particular city as well. So let's make it work. There we go. So what I'm planning to do today is to talk about two case studies on the same city, the city of Palmyra in modern day Syria. And it will have two aspects to it. First, a city in a global context. You know, what is the interaction between the local situation and evolution of an urban center against the backdrop of what is happening in the region or globally? And second case study, we'll look at the local circumstances and their impact on global geopolitics and how, you know, so from the local perspective, how the changes to very local situation affects big time, big picture, big global picture. So let me introduce the city. I know I don't have to introduce it, you all know Palmyra, but for anyone that's kind of slept through that undergrad class, it is a large city, a large Roman city in the Syrian desert. And it's a bit weird because as you can see in this picture, it is a pretty big city in a desert, which is pretty crazy. And we'll talk about how crazy it is in the second case study. It's also a very interesting case study for geopolitics, because it was a highly independent center stuck between two gigantic and important global powers, the Roman Empire and the Parthian Empire. And you will see that a lot of its history is kind of negotiating the kind of in between those two large actors. I would say it was also one of the first time in human history where globalizations and global situation had a direct impact on people and their lives. And it is an example of a small but pretty key player in the global geopolitical game because of its unique situation in between those two empires, but also in terms of when it became a third global player. Right, so let me give you a quick, this is poorly placed here. Sorry, Carmen, I'm gonna shove you into a tiny thing.
Oh, thank you. That was actually on me.
So we can get rid of this and we can move this over here. Okay, brilliant. So quick overview. Palmyra did exist before the turn of the millennium, but we ignore that squarely. So whatever happened before, we don't care. That's pre-Palmyra. But so we, as far as we're concerned, Palmyra starts in year 1 because that's easier to count things. And really quickly, from a small caravan oasis, it becomes a city with monumental architecture. The biggest example of which is the Temple of Bel that was dedicated in year 32, which is pretty quickly. And that is the beginning of the boom for monumental architecture. So it becomes an actually big city. In 129, Hadrian visited to kind of, say, this is ours, Palmyra. You can be independent and autonomous as much as you want, but you are part of the Roman Empire. And that was important because it was a key node on the east-west trading route. So Romans did want to have a say in that. And Palmyra lived happily until something happened in the mid-3rd century, where it went through this rapid militarization and also switched from the kind of council rule into one-person rule through the period that we call the Palmyra Kingdom. That's where Augustus became the king, and after his death, Queen Zenobia ran the show. And this is the time where Palmyra, from this, you have to think about it and visualize it like this small oasis in the middle of a crappy desert, right? There's nothing growing there. There's nothing interesting there. There's just this oasis with a massive city in it. And all of a sudden, it becomes an empire. So in 271, this is the extent of the land that was under direct military control by an oasis, right? This is crazy. And all of that against the backdrop of, the Roman Empire wasn't gone yet, right? I mean, the 271. So Roman Empire on this side and, the other Eastern empires on the other side. So it exploded from being a small city into being a major global player. And we'll look at what may be the potential costs for that. But the Romans didn't wait too long. In 172, they said, well, enough is enough. Took their army and basically razed it to the ground. So that was the end of it. There is Palmyra after Palmyra, and people do really cool research on it. But as far as we're concerned, it's gone. It's over. We do not talk about Palmyra past 273. Okay. So let's look at the first question, which when we departed on this project, the main question we had was how many people were there in Palmyra and how did it change over time? And we came from this simple assumption that I'm sure a lot of you have seen already in archaeology happening quite often, that the more stuff we have, the more people we expect to be somewhere. So obviously all you have to do is count the stuff and then you will know how many people there were in relative terms more than in absolute terms, but the relative is fine. And this is the team that worked on it, Olympia Bottle and Rubina Raja. They collected data, which took 10 years and an immense amount of effort. And thank you for doing that, because I wouldn't have the patience. But as a result, we have this awesome data set, which we call the Palmyra and funerary data. It consists of portraits. Portraits look like this. Portraits look like this. Tombs and burials. And they all related in the sense that obviously people created portraits to put them in front of the tombs and inside were burials, but It is actually 3 independent data sets because it's very hard to connect the burials to tombs to portraits. So we've got 3,640 portraits, and they depict the tribal aristocracy of the city. Piles of paper have been used to describe different stylistic features of those portraits, because they also show this nice nexus between the Roman and the Eastern influence. And they're really beautiful in themselves, but because so much time and effort was spent staring at them and doing detailed analysis, we have a very good chronology of them. So we can actually trace the portraits based on stylistic features of them. And there are different types of them, most of them as depicting a bust of an individual. And they live in tombs. We've got 329 tombs that come in 3 different types. There's the tower tomb, the house or temple tomb, and then underground hypogeum. So the tombs were constructed by the aristocracy, the families, and you can see in both types those little kind of bits sticking out. This is where the bodies would be buried, and that would be blocked with the portraits. And to make it clear, this is how it looked like, right? So you've got the niches where the burials would go, and at the front you would have the portrait, which is pretty cool, actually. I think we should bring it back. I would be fine with something like that, especially if they carved it in marble, right? With the newest type of iPhone, so that future archaeologists can date me really well. The burials are mostly not found in situ. That's what I meant when I said that the 3 data sets are very independent. So we cannot really connect the burial with the portrait, with the Palmyra has been there for a while, so a lot of the excavations happened quite early on. All right. So we're going to use this thing that everyone in Cambridge knows, so I don't have to explain it in too much detail. We use the cumulative probability distributions to count the number of portraits, burials, and tombs that were used at any one time, with the kind of assumption that, oh, maybe that will tell us about the population of the city. And the way it works, for anyone who somehow slept for the computational group work here, is that, different portraits, let's go for portraits, have different kind of chronology markers. So what we do is we kind of pretend, in theory, all of those have the same area, right? So when something has a narrow chronology, it kind of adds to the curve way more. And if something has chronology that is really, really wide, it adds a little bit everywhere. So basically what we're trying to say is that at every year between 100 BC to 100 AD, there's a small probability that this portrait was created at that time. Whereas for this portrait A, there is a much higher probability that it happened sometime between 25 and 1 BC. And we add everything up, all of the portraits, all of the tombs, all of the burials, everything, and we get this nice curve. It doesn't happen on 5, right? It happens in 3,000, so it's a little bit better than this. But that is all that there is to the technique. And then you get the results, which is always very exciting, and some general patterns of what happened when we put all the portraits, all the tombs, or all the data together are pretty straightforward and tell us nothing new. So, for example, you can see that starting from the 1st century, there was a pretty constant rise in terms of the number of portraits being produced. And that is not surprising because Palmyra became bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger over time. So great, we knew that. And we also knew that it collapsed in the 1st century. But you will notice that it is slightly earlier than it should be. We'll talk about it later. And at the same time, history was happening. So Palmyrene aristocracy, they were getting their portraits, but at the same time, history of the region was happening around them. And it is always fun to kind of get all of the important historical events and then mark them as good and bad. And we can then argue whether good are good and bad are bad. But I just went for my all assessment that the plague is bad, definitely. The war, probably not great. But, when the Hadrian visits, that's probably a good thing. And I do have to tell you this little anecdote. So I analyzed this data, and I didn't actually know that much about Palmyra. So you actually get a very objective view here. And all this study was happening, kind of in May 2020. And I looked at the data, and I spoke to my two collaborators, which were way more versed in the history of Palmyra. And I said, listen, has anything happened between years, say, 160, 175? And they just went like, the plague, which was particularly funny as we were like, all sitting in our houses locked and, going through the major epidemics. So we were super happy about that result. We're like, call the news right now. Anyways, so let's look at the stuff in a little bit more detail. The fun thing is that some of the events that you would think would be important turns out not to be important. So we have several wars, the Spartan wars, that have absolutely no bearing on the data whatsoever. And that's pretty cool. And I do have to point out, because I did write a note, because people always ask me about it, a lot of stuff is dated for, say, 2nd century. So obviously a starting date will be 100. So this is a completely artificial jump. But the important thing is that certain historical events did not have an impact, and certain historical events that we're aware of did correlate quite nicely with the data. So we have some correlations with the times of prosperity and some correlations with the times of not prosperity, where everyone was locked at home. No, I'm kidding. Nobody was locked at home during the Antonine plague. Everyone was just sick. And also a little bit of correlation with monumental architecture building activity. And that made us think, because, we went in thinking, oh, we just want to count how many people lived in Palmyra or how many people died in Palmyra. But, we shouldn't have a did during the plague. That's when people die. That's not where people not die. And so we had to reevaluate, and we decided that what we're seeing is definitely not a good proxy for demography. So there you go. That was a bit of a fail. But it probably is a pretty good proxy for how much expendable income everyone has. Because, those portraits, they're quite expensive. And they're not 100% necessary, right? You can just not have one. And they kind of reflect how big the aristocracy is as well. And that would correlate way better with things like the kind of peak of caravan trade or the dip during the plague. And the most interesting thing that we noticed is that the main drop in the number of portraits that we observed in this data set happened about 20 years too early. And those 20 years are really important, because those are those 20 years which, if you remember the little map, was when Palmyra became the big empire. And so we're seeing something that is completely counterintuitive, in the sense that the peak of Palmyra, when Palmyra is one of the global players, is showing at the same time a drop in a major way of kind of prestige signaling. So the Persian Wars, and then you have the plague there as well, but all of this was actually the first war that seems to correlate with anything. And that was actually the first one that Palmyra was truly involved. But this whole period between 250 to 173, we expected to see loads of activity. We expected to see loads of aristocracy. We expected to see, Palmyra doing such a land grab, having loads of money. And it seems that in terms of expendable income, the story was very much not of the peak of Palmyra. We also look at the tombs, and they show somehow similar story. We look at the capacity of them. So how many, like when you build a family tomb, you don't build it for yourself, you build it for the future. So the capacity is very often built in such a way that that future generations can still use it for the family. And in terms of the capacity, it increases up until mid-2nd century, after which it drops and kind of plateaus. And you know, this could be fewer tombs or smaller tombs, and we checked that, and it's actually fewer tombs. So in terms of size, they continue more or less the same size throughout the history. And at the same time, we have this interesting kind of side situation, which is the tomb concessions. So tomb concessions is where Palmyra aristocracy decided that they actually don't need the whole tomb, and they're going to sell some of it to some other family. So now 2 families can use the tomb, and it's basically a way of saving money for the family that built the tomb in the first place, but also for another family that instead of building a whole tomb for themselves, they can kind of lease half of the tomb that already exists. And that also kind of peaked in the 1st century. So it looks like, you know, some of this kind of funerary activity that was definitely really expensive dropped or at least reduced in the 1st century and slightly before. So to conclude this, we've got a nice, lovely period of growth until mid-2nd century in Palmyra. Then we have a war and a plague. That sounds familiar, huh? We just had plague and war, but almost the same. Then we've got a peak that happens in the 1st half of the 1st century, which is not what usually is pointed out in Palmyra. And then we have a much earlier collapse in terms of, especially portrait production. So, there's some caveats. This is one data set. And I would like to see the same stuff done on several data sets, on pottery, coins, glass, buildings, whatever we can put our hands on, to see whether the same patterns emerge in other types of archaeological material. So that would also make it more representative, and we would know which of the little patterns are just kind of the patterns in funerary data, and which one of them are actually good proxies for the society at large. The historical events, it was extremely objective, my selection, because I did not know the history of Palmyra, so I was super objective, but you do not have to trust me. I think other people could pick up some other events and say, well, actually, your correlations suck. Fair. So in the future, we just need to count other things and compare that. And if you want to read more about it, look at the data or the analysis. This is all online. All right. If nobody's asleep, I mean, your guys get through it. I mean, it's a terrible weather and it's late. We can move. If anyone has a question right now, that is a good moment. Yes.
I just wonder whether you know the debate between Ian Morris and Anthony Snodgrass about the data set from Athens, where the Snodgrass interpreted in terms of demographic terms, and then Morris replied that it was access to burial.
Yeah.
I just wonder whether you knew that.
I know that, and you know, when people come and say, "Well, Isa, actually, you're totally wrong. This is not."
Well, I'm not saying it's the same.
And you can 100% say, because I have zero evidence that it is the economic thing. What I think we do have evidence for, that is definitely not demographics, which was a problem for me, because that's what I was
interesting comparison.
Yeah. Right, yeah, and I feel like the only solution here, because we can sit here and argue, and I will be like, no, it's economy, and you can be, no, it's something else. Forever. We just need to do more of those, right? And then, you know, if the same repeats on monumental architecture or on pottery or stuff, we know, but I have zero arguments for economy other than waving my arms very fast. Yes.
I have a question. So, who was making all of these? So the kind of portraits and so on. Because I was just thinking about that they did, and obviously that depends on you being able to make it.
Yeah.
And obviously, play with obviously more people, and then that means there are less people who are skilled in that. That kind of being able to do that craft.
Yeah.
So whether you wanted to, as a rich person, if you wanted to do that a lot, you might not be able to. And that's what you see, because that your relative problem, not because of that they're white typing as is the rich people, it's just they can't have access.
I'm totally taking your argument, yeah.
And then I was just curious.
It is 100% possible you know, the dip isn't that low. I wish it was lower. It would be better. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It could be just the craftsman became not available as far as I know, and please do not quote me on it because I know very little about the portraits themselves. There was no drop in quality. Yeah. And you know, I don't know whether this is a good enough evidence, but yes, craftsmen could have been decimated by the plague. And no, the problem with the plague is like we don't actually know how much its impact on anything. Like, you know, the estimates are between, you know, 30% of the Roman Empire died to, oh, we're just making it up, like nobody died, everyone was fine. So, but this is a very good interpretation. And again, the only solution is to count other things. And then they'll know whether, if craft production went across the board, then we'll have a better idea. Any more questions? Yes.
It's been a long time, and I wonder whether the climate changes have some impact on the droughts, especially the collapse of it.
Holds to it, my friend. We're going to be talking about exactly this.
Oh,
Yes. This is the perfect right in the next topic. Okay, so everyone else hold your questions until after. But thank you. That is a perfect, climate change. And then you can think, you know, like I really wish I'm sketching out this picture of this like tiny oasis in the middle of this really horrible, inhospitable desert. And the question is, how can a city actually exist in that kind of circumstances? Even now, you know, there's a big motorway and people have lorries and there's only 50,000 people living there, right? So it's not a big place even now with our technology. So who on earth thought it was a good idea to put a city in this awful, God-forsaken place? And, you know, one cannot eat money. So what on earth did they eat in that desert? So again, this is the team. Joan did a lot of the analysis, and then Rubina and Ivan are specialists in global studies and global history and Palmyra. Okay, so if you ask any specialist or any person like me who read a whole one book about Palmyra, what is Palmyra subsistence based? Everyone will say trade. Palmyra is renowned for being a trade city. Definitely trade, yes. Nobody ever mentions anything else because trade was the reason why Palmyra was actually something. So you can barely see it, but it's here. And it was a key kind of node on this route between the Mediterranean coast and Asia. So people would, and remember there are big rivers here. So people would kind of jump to Dura Europas, and then Palmyra was the next place where you can actually sit down and have some water. So pretty critical. And that trade was mostly long distance, so caravan trade. But you know, maybe a little bit of agriculture. That's not often mentioned, but I like to remind everyone that one cannot eat money, and also carrying kilograms and kilograms and kilograms of grain over large distances over a desert is never a good idea. And nobody has ever in history done anything like that, except for, I don't know, military kind of supplies and stuff. And that is fine to do it for a year or maybe two, but not for 270. That's not likely. All right, so we're going to look at this study, and it's consists of 5 steps. In the first step, we figure out how far can you get from Palmyra. Then step number 2, where can you plant any food on this awful desert? Step number 3 is how much can you harvest from the places where you can plant stuff. We'll also calculate how many people were involved in actually dealing with the crops, because they also need to eat. So they probably had the first dips on any food. And that will give us the total amount that is left for the city. And we're looking at the maximum, right? So we're not trying to kind of reconstruct how much we're trying to reconstruct what is the maximum that you can get out of the hinterland of Palmyra. So in terms of calculating how far you can get from Palmyra, we actually used, thank you British people, 1940s British Army maps that look like this. This is really cool. And the different areas, they show you how easy it is to cross it or not. And we digitized it and used it because, you know, if a British military truck cannot get through, then probably camels will not be that happy either. And we also use some Russian aerial photos for water sources, which is the most critical element when it comes to the Syrian desert. So we mapped the impassable areas, and we mapped water sources, and Palmyra is here, by the way. Here. And from that, we got this lovely. We could have just drawn this circle and it would have been much faster, but there you go. We did science. From this, you get like a lovely map that shows you how far can you get in 1 day, in 3 days, and in 5 days of camel distance travel. We checked on camels because that's what you use in this area. And in 99% of cases that we did a literature review on, the food for the city comes from 1 day distance. And this is because people that do the fields, they have to be able to get to the city, sell their stuff, and then get back. We're in a special place. So we decided that we'll give Palmyra a little bit more than 1 day. So we gave it 2 days, and which is the orange. 3 days, which is the orange envelope. And that actually correlates a little bit, you know, squinting with a known border of Palmyrene land, as recorded in the 1st century. And in this envelope of 3 days kind of camel travel, we identified 4 areas where you can actually plant crops and irrigate it. And the reason for that is that water is the major issue. So there is no water in the desert. Irrigation is the only way where you can have robust and sustainable crops over time that you can actually count on. If you want to plant something, you can. The soil are actually fantastic, and you know, if it had more water, everything would grow there. But in 5 out of 10 times, it will fail because of the lack of water. So that's fine if you're, say, sitting somewhere and you do a kind of next to your house little field for your own family, but it's probably not a good subsistence base for a big city like Palmyra. So we only looked at areas that that were dependable. And those 4 main agricultural areas are the oasis itself, then the Atarka depression, which can collect water from all of this area here. Then we have fields north of the Habarka Dam, and also the oasis of Burak that can collect water from here. Everywhere else, you can only do small scale agriculture that would be fine for supporting a family, but not to kind of have excess food that can be sold to the city. And then we went to the UN website and installed one of their tools, which is called Aquacrop. And it's basically designed, it's basically a simple software designed to calculate how much crops will you get in a semi desert or dry climate kind of situation, given certain agricultural values. So soils, water availability, the fallow and field management systems. And that's a pretty widely used tool, and it works for now. So we assumed it will work for the past as well. We then calculated the workforce using the Cologne tableau. So, you know, in every harvesting kind of situation, like in every agricultural situation, the bottleneck activities are during the harvest is just after. So harvesting, threshing, and winnowing. And that will give us, you know, the minimum number of people that had to work on the fields. And then we can do some epic calculations. So from every area, we calculated how many tons of barley you could get. And we're using barley because it's the most water kind of resistant crop. So if they were to plant something better than barley, we know that people in Palmyra ate all sorts of things, not just barley. But if they plant something more, then our total estimate of calories would go down because they would need more water for it. So if they planted wheat or fruit or whatever, they would use more water per calorie than this. So this is because we're trying to calculate the maximum number of calories that can be done. So we get the barley, and this is what you can get from each of those 4 areas, which translate to those kind of ranges of populations minus the workers. So the final total is 65 to 92,000 people, assuming that Palmyra was happening now. So this is on the modern kind of climate data. And that's pretty cool because they've been previous attempts at quantifying how many people lived in Palmyra, and they went from 10,000 to 200,000. So we can definitely cut it from the 200,000 down, significantly down. But let's look at what happens when climate change. Perfect question. Because in those semi-arid environments, it's not like here in the UK. Here, the margin of error is really small, like 50 milliliters more of rain is everything. And so when climate changes even a little bit, you're already on the limit. There isn't that much slack in the system. So we looked at the annual changes, and well, first we calculated what is the maximum food production for different annual rainfalls. So if you have 0, then you get here. If you have 50 milliliters, you get here. If you have 100 milliliters, you get here. And it kind of plateaus at about 150 milliliters per annum, so annually. Because there's no more one, basically, because of the fallow, etc. And this is the modern rainfall. This is where it usually happens. It's between 100 and 170 milliliters. But what was it in the past? Was it the same? No, it wasn't. So we looked at, in total, we looked at 47 climate proxies, and most of them were useless. So in the end, we ended up with looking at Storage Cave, which is close by, and also the Dead Sea levels. And we noticed that in terms of climate, it was getting progressively drier as we went over the history of Palmyra. And this is actually not particularly surprising for anyone that does Roman archaeology. Everyone knows that the 3rd century is, there are traces of climate change and kind of dry spell that happened, that lasted either until the 4th century or 5th century. For some reason, nobody can decide if it's the 4th or 5th, which is irrelevant for us anyways, because it's past the end of Palmyra. But from our local climate sources, it looks that, basically the climate change was okay. The climate was fine initially, but it got continuously worse and worse. And we calculated how many years Palmyra could basically, what was the carrying capacity every year, given the amount of rain that was coming. And you can see that from 5 to, if you want your crop to basically happen 5 out of 10 years, then you could feed between 90,000 people, and at the end, the end of the Palmyran life, about 70,000. But you cannot keep your people hungry for 5 years. I mean, people don't survive 5 years without food. I mean, good try, but no. So let's look at 9 out of 10, because that 1 year, not great, but maybe you can actually, for a lot of expense, bring some food in and kind of weather the storm, right? And that starts, you know, quite nicely for 40,000 people. We know there were no 40,000 people in Palmyra in year 0, obviously. So that's that there's a lot of kind of distance between how much food can be produced versus how many people they are in the city. But around the second half of the 3rd century, this comes shockingly close to about 30,000 people, which is, I can tell you from another study, probably the number of people that lived in Palmyra at that time. So 30,000 is what we're getting from the city size and what we're getting from the number of houses that were available there. And, you know, this is a really small margin. You know, if you can feed 30,000 people and you've got 30,000 people, and we don't even talk about any losses of this grain to transport, pest, you know, whatever stuff that happens with food, then, you know, this is the period where we think the crunch time happens then. The second half of the 1st century, in our interpretation, became a period with very, very shaky food security for the city of Palmyra. And, you know, this is the time. This is the time where Palmyra stopped making portraits and became this gigantic empire. And now the question is, where has there been any relationship between those two things? You know, when you cannot feed your people, you become pretty desperate because hungry people are angry people. And this is, you know, pure speculation at this point. Obviously, you cannot get it from modeling land use. But this is the time where Palmyra went through this militarization phase, switched from, you know, a council governance to authoritarian regime, pretty much, and attacked everyone around. Pretty much everyone that they could put their hands on, they went after them. And, you know, this wouldn't be the first time that we see food security linked with conflict in the Middle East or anywhere else in the world. So that's quite interesting. You can see more, you can read more about it in the paper we published last year, and also all the data and all the scripts are available online. All right, so to sum up, before we can get to wine. So in terms of, you know, Palmyra, we all love Palmyra. In terms of the history, it was cool to see how, you know, some historical events, so some of the global stuff that was happening around seemed to have an impact, at least on our data, while others that were, you know, seemingly very similar did not. And I feel like this is really cool because whilst historians will tell us, well, this happened, that happened, we have the ability to say, and what was the impact of those historical events on the population? This is in our hands, in our lovely archaeological hands. And you know, I think that's way more interesting than just tracing which war and who, which general and whatever. So the biggest find that we came across is that the political peak of Palmyra may not have been as happy for the inhabitants of the city as was previously assumed. We also narrowed the population estimates for Palmyra, which is lovely. You know, showing what was physically possible is also important because, again, you know, historical sources will tell us only so much. And you know, the food security is something that, you know, we are quite concerned about in the current state. And it is actually very easy to calculate it for most archaeological case studies. So I think, you know, when we're trying to figure out different hypotheses for why, because behind historical events, that could be one of the possible hypotheses that should be tested. So the important thing to note is that, you know, like this multi-proxy approach, when you look at different stuff, different types of material cultures, different aspects of the same process, it gives you a way more comprehensive picture woven from different strands of evidence, which then should be tested against each new evidence that comes along. And I think, you know, it really shows how we do have the ability to shed light on some of the contemporary issues that we're facing nowadays, because we have this unprecedentedly good sample of comparative material over the last, 10,000 years and beyond. That, if we do some systematic data collection on it and rigorous analysis, we have a comparative samples of, is it just Palmyra where food security correlated with a conflict or with switch to authoritarian regime, or is it a common story throughout the history? And what can we learn from that? Maybe it's just Palmyra, and then just a blip of history happened there. Maybe it is not, and answering that question is actually pretty critical now for us now. So the anti-caveat, the good things is that we put all of the data sets on Zenodo, so you can all do your own analysis. And if you don't want to do one, you can also use the scripts and find any possible bugs and problems in that. And that means that the next group that comes can redo the whole thing and argue with the interpretation, and it's completely open to critique and testing and adding other data and modeling it in a different way. This is how we push science forward. So in the future, I promise I'll stop in 2 minutes. The next step is a lovely little ADM model of urban dynamics to see how this interactions between people, demography, money, food, how it all can kind of come together in terms of in those urban dynamics that can be quite complex. And I'm really hoping, fingers crossed, come on ERC, do your magic. That we could do a large-scale comparative data analysis where we don't just look at Palmyra. I mean, it's just one random city, but really kind of get the data. The data is there. You just have to put it into one place across multiple cities, across regions, across periods, and start drawing those bigger conclusions that are not just hand-wavy, but come from the data analysis itself. And I will not talk about how cool it is to model a city. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
There's a way happening
Ah, yes. Thank you, people online. That was super cool.
Okay. Do you have any questions?
But please do ask questions. Because if you don't, then I'll feel sad.
Then I'm just going to give you.
Yeah, no, plenty of questions. Awesome. Grill me, my friends.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. So I want to ask the rationale behind only considering the 2-day range around Palmyra. Because one thing is that the river Euphrates is not very far from and
The river,
the Euphrates.
250 kilometers.
But potentially they might have some success too. And the other thing is that I imagine, for example, on the Silk Roads, there are a lot of oasis states. And is it possible that every state is self-sustainable in terms of food or?
Yeah, so this is a very good question. And then I will tell you what is the other possible, So this is what everyone asks about. They just brought food, right? And that's why we had Ivan's on the team. So he's the historian of global history, global trade history. And he reeled off a list of cases where there was mass starvation, even though there was food available 70 kilometers away. So you can totally bring food over 250 kilometers. Absolutely, this is 100% technologically possible. It costs stupid money. So you can absolutely do it if there's an army or, once in a while, but to do it consistently for 3 centuries, that just makes zero economic sense. So all of this long distance trade is on things like, muslin or, small items, because that makes economic sense. Bringing tons and tons of grain is possible, but it's not sustainable strategy. I mean, the city would literally not be able to afford it in the long term. That's why we looked at this 9 out of 10, because we do think that food could come from further away, but the cost would be prohibitive. I'm not going to mention the Irish starvation.
Yeah, so how can you imagine how you find irrigable stuff for those?
Yeah.
That was already.
That was so much fun. That was so much fun. The University of Bergen, again, that's why we have Adrian on board, did a massive survey throughout the area. And some of the areas are very easy to destruct because they're salt plains, so you can throw anything there. And some of the areas, I wish I had this picture, are mountainous. And it's like, it's not very high, the mountains, but they're extremely steep. So you look at them and it's like, so you cannot really grow anything there. The 4 areas are identified because there is evidence for agriculture on them, including evidence from Roman times, and also, as opposed to everywhere else, this is where the capture areas for the water coming through the valleys would be. There's also been an experiment where Syrian government said, yay, let's make, hanging gardens in the desert of Syria. And they used actually one of those areas. So we actually went online and traced with a bit of a buffer, because we're trying to do the maximum possible, the edges of the fields that were cultivated in the 60s. And may I just add that failed as an experiment. It was not producing enough food, and people literally kind of evacuated because they were starving. And that's in the 60s. And you've also seen the climate curve. So the modern, there was actually more water in the 20th century than in the 1st and 2nd century. So all of this was, all of this area we basically delineated from known survey, etc. data, but we also added quite a margin around them. This is max.
I'm sorry, everybody what's your name?
Thank you, Isa, for the presentation. Really, as a computational part, I was bothered in doing the southern Ireland, Sahel, which is another area, some area of food security. My question is, how or have you or will you consider livestock in the?
Yes, this is the second one that I thought, we should break. I love it that we always did the same question. So yes, because Palmyra tribes are pastoralist tribes, right? So we know there was stock there. And we did think about it long and hard. And obviously stock brings food, calories. It is also very difficult to convince people to give you something, for nothing. And what happens in both this area and a number of other areas where we looked at ethnographic record is that what usually happens is that the pastoralists exchange some of their stock for grain. So that doesn't solve anything. There are also extra people that you need to feed. So we think that this probably brought in some calories, but we don't think it was significant. And we're happy for people to model it and prove us wrong. But there are a number of those kind of fuzz factors. So the fact we don't consider loss to transport and storage, which usually is up to 30, well, it's usually about 30%. We don't even consider that. We don't consider the fact that Palmyrans did not eat barley for every meal of their life. We have very good evidence they ate very nice food, which would again push it down. But at the same time, we also don't consider food that comes from the tribes that use the pasture. We know that Palmyrans were very keen on getting food from the area because we have this tax document preserved, and it says that basically they slap a tax on anything that comes from outside of the territory. Remember that little line when I said this is the border of Palmyra? So anything that came from within the territory could come in tax-free. and everything outside had to pay taxes. So they clearly, you know, put a lot of effort into taking care of their hinterland. But yes, okay, yeah.
One of the potential perhaps questions is that yes, our case studies with low scale agricultural pastoralists, we might see that directly part of exchange, but if we are thinking that state urban context, we might perhaps think of purchases.
Yeah,
And that would
yeah, so they could definitely buy some stock, livestock. There isn't that much livestock you can actually have on that desert, but they could definitely get a goat, you know. We just don't think this would be enough to make such a big difference. Yeah, you know, like, you know, imagine how many of that stock you would have to basically wrestle out of the tribes to feed extra 10,000 people per year. Hard.
Any questions from the audience? No, I have 2 questions on mine.
Mhm.
No? Okay, no, okay. So I have a first question from Sue. I'm so sorry if I pronounce the names wrong. When the, okay, 3 actually, while these are coming. The Palmyra and Forum was so extensive, ranging from Anatolia to Egypt, that some of the aristocratic elites, I think that's related to your first part of the talk, become landowners in extended areas, moved into the newly acquired country estates, where they died and were buried with the tombs, portraits, for example, etc., rather than in the Palmyra itself.
Cool, that is a cool idea. Yeah, I love it. I'm not 100% sure that has happened. I will have to kind of refer you to people that you know the history a little bit better. It is only a few decades, so it's not that, you know, you would have a lot of people moving and settling in new places. And I don't know whether there's any evidence for that, but you know, it was a very short-lived empire, very short-lived empire. So I don't know how many of them managed to kind of make it outside and settle there. But that's a cool line that should be.
Okay, are you ready for the second question?
Hit me.
From Rebecca. Thank you for the amazing lecture. It is very interesting. I've heard much about surveys in that region that were there and identified farm houses, even temporary ones, around the site. If so, did they match locations that you identify as most visible? And so far, I think we talk about this.
No, they were correct. So Palmyra was a project led by University of Bergen. And they did as extensive survey as it gets in terms of, like, you know, what can you do in a, I don't know, 5-year project with limited number of people. So we don't have very good evidence, but they identified buildings, they identified bodies, they identified irrigation structures, and they identified the four areas. Like, we totally steal from them. So yes, those were the 4 areas that were identified by the survey.
So one last question from Janai. So he is actually studying in the University of Edinburgh historical period, northern Pakistan and Afghanistan. And he really likes the idea that often cultivable land is scarce. When cultivable land is scarce, people struggle to secure it. So his question is how, like his area, specifically in modern Palmyra Valley, doesn't have much data to quantify. There are some historically found lots from Chinese monks traveling to India. So how reliable can a similar approach be in such situations?
Probably not very. You see, I come from this philosophy of, you know, any model is better than no models, because a model can be replaced by a better model. But if you don't have a starting model, then it's hard to build upon it. You do need something to count, and that could be anything. That could be pottery, that could be houses, that could be mentions in written sources, whatever you get. And it does have to come in kind of quantities that go into at least thousands for it to be, you know, robustly enough in terms of robustness. And you also do need a chronology on it. So we were lucky with the portraits, and you know, we spent a lot of time in archaeology trying to get chronology nailed. So I feel like, you know, any try is a good try, but it can be impossible if the data sets go in, let's say, low hundreds, and you don't have, you know, if you have 300 pieces of cloth dated to 300 years, that the whole curve will be just like one square, right? So you're not going to really learn much from it. So it does depend on the data. But the good thing is, you know, if you can apply any data that has, you know, not before and not after date. So the kind of main innovation of the portrait study is that nobody has ever counted them, right? And nobody has ever used them in the kind of county way of using data. Everyone always kind of looked at, you know, how much somebody smiles or what is the hair, etc. And that was the main innovation, that we took history of art data and turned them into a proxy for economy of the city. Oh, we have
I've got a question.
Anything else from the line that go for it? Oh, I'm on you.
and then you'll learn what it means when food insecurity happens to a group.
So the population who are living there, are this aristocracy, have they their wealth? Do we know if they've got their wealth off mainly off the trade network, or whether they actually came in, they're more mobilized, that they came in different areas as sort of already elite type political families of the area, or?
No, so we actually know quite, okay, when I say quite a lot about it, the Palmyra people will kill me on it. No, those were, so we know there were tribes, and they were originally pastoralists, and they kind of came together and they created the council, and the wealth was pretty high. So we also know they did eat barley for breakfast, lunch and dinner. And I'm not sure how much we have any kind of migrations documented from outside of Palmyra. I know that we don't have access to almost any bones, so it's really hard to do. Well, we don't have access to the site, right? I mean, it's gone. But the human remains were, yeah, are not available. So yeah, we cannot really do much on that. In terms of, you know, the aristocracy, we're pretty sure they're local, because with the portraits they would also write an inscription, and that's actually what I've been analyzing the last few days. And it's world's most boring inscriptions. It's like Malik, the son of Malik, the son of Malik, the son of Malik is buried here. So from the names themselves, they were all local. There are occasionally like some other names kind of pop out, but all of them are awful. And most of the inscriptions are actually in Palmyrene, and in the graves, I can tell you all about it, because I actually did the data analysis, I swear to God, 2 days ago, on the plane coming here. In the graves, it's like 97% of the inscriptions in the funerary context are Palmyrene or Palmyrene and Greek.